Hi, good morning. Nice to be here. As you can hear, I'm British, but I work in a Swedish university in Gothenburg. And I had the great pleasure to work with the Plants, People, Planet team as an editor on this issue, Standing in the Shadows of Plants, in which we wanted to revisit a theory that came out sort of late 1990s by two American botanist educators, Jim Wandesey, who I had the pleasure to know as a doctoral student and he mentored me, and Elizabeth Schussler. And what we wanted to do with this issue is actually revisit their theory in terms of a multidisciplinary approach and to revisit it in terms of the language that they used and also new studies in humanities, philosophy, science and education. I guess this is the moment where I say I'm not a scientist with a big S. I did fine art and then I studied ecology, so I'm a kind of a walking hybrid. And I'm really rubbish at PCs. I'm a Mac woman, so I hope I don't mess this up. I am going to draw on the special issue, but I wanted to extend the debates that we started with the special issue. I didn't just want to go back to the special issue. And one of the things that working on the special issue really made me think about was our notions as human beings of time. And I want you to think back now, just take a moment to think about, and this draws on one of the articles where they asked scientists to think about the plants they have relationships with, where the passion comes from and the moment that they made that relationship. But I want you to think about time, not just in terms of the plants you work with and how you came across them, but time in terms of you as a human being. How does your day go? What do you think about in your day? What does it mean to take 5 minutes to do something? What would it be like if you weren't a human, if you were a plant during a process of flowering? What would time mean to you then? Are we trapped in a human understanding of time? And does that inhibit our relationship, our perspectives on plants? And if we took more time to be with plants, would that make a difference to us as a species? And as plant scientists, we're kind of in a different space to other people who are not necessarily working with plants. We don't necessarily have the feeling for the organism that Barbara McClintock talked about. So just take that moment to sort of think about your time-space relationships with plants. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at some researchers in the humanities and the arts and how we've worked together to think about being with plants and trying to understand them. And I'm going to start with a piece of literature. I don't know if any of you have read this book by the Japanese-American writer Ozeki, Time Being. But there's a moment where one of the characters, Ruth, is with her partner Oliver, who's an artist working with trees and notions of time, and he actually works with living trees to create events in forests concerned with commenting on the Anthropocene, the name that some people are giving to the acceleration of human impact. And I think it's very interesting, the two perspectives on time and being with those large, older trees that the two humans take. So Ruth says, we're nothing, wiping her eyes because the emotion of this is so overwhelming. We're barely here at all. And then Oliver is completely different. He says, yes, isn't it great? And they can live to be 1,000 years. And I think for me, this piece of literature represents the two human perspectives around time in relation to older trees and the points in history that we both inhabit, both humans and the elderly trees. And I'm very glad that Nicola brought up the 1,000-year-old olive trees today. And I think some of the question in Italy is the coming together of human emotion of being with those trees and knowing those trees, and the thought of actually having to kill them for the future of olive trees. So I think that's one of the scientific, social, emotional problems we have today. And as someone working in social science and humanities, I think that's the way we can work with scientists. And I think the special issue, in part, has started to do some of those questions. How many of you have actually seen the special issue on plant blindness? So some of you are familiar with some of the discussions. And it's a very broad range. I mean, my colleague Giovanni Alloy, for instance, talks about plants representing a political national state and how plants can be seen to disrupt identity. So we've heard a lot this morning about what's happening to plants and plant knowledge. And this, I was here in 2017 for the State of the World's Plants Report. And these two lines just always resonate with me, always. Whenever I read them, it's just like, it's such a powerful statement about what extinction really is. And a few weeks ago, I was in Lisbon at an ecology conference looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. And I asked the audience to think, well, what if you just inserted extinction of humans is an absolute term, and just trying to get people to think about us becoming extinct and what kind of social relations that provocation might set up. And then moving on to how humans see animals and plants and the living beings that we share the world with. This is, you probably are all very familiar with this, but this is quite common that, you know, as a species, we can often name a mammal or a bird that has recently become extinct, but it's uncommon for us to remember the death, the extinction of a plant. Not uncommon, possibly, for this group. But how does this group speak to everyone else? And that's kind of the space I've been working in most of my life. So we're learning more and more about the intertwinement, the entanglement, the assemblage that we belong to. And there's this sort of language issue about it, the organisms out there, them, us, and we. And I work with two amazing artists, Bryndís Snæbjørnsdóttir from Iceland and Mark Wilson from Cumbria in the UK. And they've done a lot of work on the Anthropocene and animals, and we partnered them for a research study. It was the first time they'd then shifted attention to plants. And they've constantly, over the years they've been working, asked the critical question, who is the we of we? And how do we make human beings a sort of common player in a multitude of players? And I think that for ecologists, it is this question, how loose is the boundary where it ends and we begin? You know, what is nature? We've heard a lot of conversations this morning about human beings being empowered and made healthy by relationships with the natural world. How do we measure that? And also social prescription. And I want to move now a bit, I guess, to this language that we use, you know, and I think Richard Fortey, he wrote a really nice essay in a book. It was an arts book from the Natural History Museum, and he wrote an opening essay. It was an artist that had a session in the Galapagos, curated by Birgit Arins, the arts curator there. And I think this is very important. You know, every species has a narrative of its own, a biography. The loss of a species is not just one lower point on a graph of biodiversity. It's the loss of unique stories. And for me, that's the arena in which we work in as humanities arts people, like finding these stories that make a difference to human perception and unraveling the assemblages that are these complex stories. And as you are all aware, there are forests burning all across the planet right now, not just in South America, but in the Congo as well, and in the Siberian Arctic. And this was an essay from Fundación Solón, which is from Bolivia, and I thought this image was just so powerful, and the writing that went with it. I don't know if any of you read it. It was quite widely published. But for me, going back to that question I asked you the first time I came up here, that question of time and being a human being and trying to have some empathy for the other time zones that other organisms occupy. For me, the sloth and the emergent canopy tree and the relationship they have is quite powerful, because where does the sloth go, this very slow-moving animal, when the fires come to it? Where does it seek solace and refuge? It goes to the largest, oldest tree. How much time does the sloth and the tree have? Can they keep time in the face of the fire? And is that a metaphor for humans' impact on other living things? And I thought it was one of the most powerful uses of a photograph and text, and really provoked me into thinking, you know, some organisms are very fast, but what if you are slow or static? What is your resilience? What are your possibilities in the face of this change? So working with Bryndis and Mark, one of the things that we've done is we've actually worked together. We have Bente Eriksson from Lund University, who's a taxonomist scientist, and then there are quite a few of us from Gothenburg Education Department, Eva Nyberg, Anna-Maria Hibkis, Irma Brokovic, who's a psychologist, and myself. And we have a PhD student, Margareta Häggström, who's actually looked at forests responding to some of Nicola's questions. And we've really thought about how can we use art as a way of thinking and a way of provoking these new spaces and bringing different narratives to the viewer. And there were 3 installations across Gothenburg Botanic Garden, the first in Flores Rilke's gallery, and there were 14 portraits of seeds, and they were scanned at Chalmers scanning electron microscope. And then the artists hand-coloured them to try and get them as near to the colours that they actually exhibit. They weren't highly coloured, as in some artistic representations. And the interesting thing for me in terms of like, what are we privileging in the narrative is that the adult plant was in the background, the seed was in the foreground, and this is Henrik Zetterlund's story. So the human becomes a scientific footnote. And the responses we've had to this is about making visible the untold story of the seed. People have really responded strongly to that. And the communities we've asked questions of in terms of what is your impression here are trainee teachers and public visitors. And what we're finding in this research is that as Hu Fang says, that looking at the plants means becoming immersed in the world of the other. And I'm not sure if we've answered this question, but I think it's a question for all of us to think about. Is looking the reconciliation of divided existence? When you take the images that you use to communicate your science, how do you portray plants? Could that space be something that we could work together as social scientists, humanities, and plant scientists? In the building where I work, one of the outcomes of the project, and it was on site for nearly a year, was this huge 14-meter tapestry. So we have a four-story stairwell, and it was sent to Norway, and it was 29 separate scans of a Stipa pinnata awn. And in Norway, they had the technology to make it into a wall tapestry. And we wanted people coming into the building to be confronted by plantness. And we wanted scale to really, to take that very small thing, make it huge, and then face people. So we were making a space of, as Bente would say, confrontation between plantness and humans. And this is part of one of our research questions. You know, if we do this with art, if we take a different view, does it increase understanding and sensitivity to the lives of plants? And this is what I think, that being with the installations, and there were 2 more. There was one in a very old barn called Stolporden, and the print was bigger than this space here. It was huge. And you go into the building and you smell the humic soil from underneath because there are gaps in the floorboards. So you're very much, you feel like you're in a seed starting life. And then the final one was a window in a rain shelter. So you were looking through one of the last remaining natural habitats of this plant to a hybrid version of it in the garden. So it was this meeting point between habitat, human collection, and hybridity. And I think that what their art does is they give us these spaces to linger with questions, you know, to try and think about, we're so different from plants. How do we step over that bridge? Can art help us to do that? So I quickly want to say something about language and communication. I have a colleague in Coimbra in Portugal. He's called Antonio. And he also is arts-based, but he's worked very closely with ecologists in the Centre for Functional Ecology. And they developed a podcast. But what they did is they asked people their questions rather than taking questions from ecologists to the general community. And I didn't have room, but there's another one, Are Mushrooms Plants, which I know the people who cross over the fungi plants interest will find a pointer. But for me, going to people and finding out what their questions are is actually socially really powerful. And my favourite is this one. Can I have plants in my bedroom? It says so much about how we perceive plants and can we live with them? Can we sleep with them? You know, it's a mountain of social science there. But it's also a mountain of curiosity, you know. The underlying thing is, I'd like to have plants in my bedroom, you know, I'd like to build a relationship, you know. And why are plants green? Yeah, why are plants green? It's a really simple question, but it's quite complex. And then, because we're all talking about communication and science here, this happened this week, and I found it fascinating in terms of that space. This was the science paper that came out. And this is what Botany 1 did to it. It's fascinating, isn't it, the translation. And this is critical, gradients of stress and disturbance. Because humans are also struggling with this all over the world right now. But yeah, how do plants find a place they can call a home? That really resonates with humanity. But does it send enough of the science? And that's that critical line that we're constantly working with. So I want to end with a couple of things on research and policy. And our research project is really complicated. It's got multiple arenas. We have an online survey for trainee teachers. We ask them about 30 questions about their affective questions, their perception questions, their knowledge questions. We've started analysing and publishing papers on that. These are the 6 scientific narrative strands that we discussed as a group, and then we realised they weren't 6 separate scientific narrative strands, but they had complex interweaving relationships. This is the giant steeper print that I was telling you about. And you saw that, it's a Heuchera seed that you saw earlier. And these are the spaces we're working in, because as we become more urban, these presented nature spaces of botanic gardens, natural history museums, science centres, those spaces are often the place where people are meeting plants in the big cities of the world. So we need to research them. We need to research these presented world settings. And I think it's always important when we're at these places to showcase the research of other researchers that are working in our field. And I met Alex, I met him last week at a science research education conference. And we're starting to form a group looking at different methods, quantitative, qualitative, of examining phenomena around seeing plants. And what I find exciting about Alexandros is he is working in early childhood education. And he's looking at the position of plants in textbooks. And I want to end sort of with a few slides because I want to talk about language in a different way. There's been a lot of discussion around the language plant blindness. It's a deficit model. It might be seen as a medical model. It could be seen as ableist. And I think one of the phrases that people haven't really taken from Wandersley and Schuessler, they talk about botanical horizons. And I think that is a really powerful phrase because, you know, what is the horizon between us and plants? How can we shift it? What kind of senses are we using? And I really enjoyed, sorry, my stutter. Anyway, your talk. When you said about different ways into plant knowledge: tasting, knowing, sniffing, taxonomy. And I liked it when you said about the indigenous and the taxonomists coming together. And for me, that's what the work is that we're doing. It's exploring these botanical horizons, these nexus where plants and people meet. And critical geography has said that we need to really reveal our interconnectivity, and we've got to ask these hard questions: what categories are useful and what are not? We've got to provoke ourselves. And so I'm going to provoke you with a question from my colleague, Helena Pedersen, who's in critical animal studies. And she asked last year, where are the animals in the sociology of climate change? And my question to you is, where are the plants? Thank you.